Okay, do you have a notification that says Youri is recording the call? Okay, fantastic. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. Tonight, I'm so honored with the guest I have on. I'm going to be speaking to, we are joined by Rachel Small, who heads World Beyond War's Canada chapter. She is a peace campaigner, anti-mining, justice activist, anti-war and anti-imperialist, as well as a solidarity activist to Canada's First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And so many topics to discuss. But before we get to it, first of all, Rachel, thanks for coming on the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's a real honor to have you. And the first question I wanted to ask you, Rachel, because I've always been a huge fan of your work, and I've always been quite fascinated by your background, because if I'm not mistaken, you're a Jewish anti-Zionist, feminist, queer liberationist, social justice, racial justice, warrior, pretty much, right? Or
yeah, no, those are a lot of the boxes for sure. Yeah.
So for me, you're almost like the perfect superheroine. Like, I mean, like if I was like to create like a superhero, it would basically come in the form of you. So the first question I have to ask you is, can you talk a bit about your background, particularly the fact that you are of a Jewish background, but you are anti-Zionist, and how did you come to how did you come to be anti-Zionist, and was that was that difficult to come out of that closet when when so much of of the Jewish communities, those not even from Israel, do tend to be quite we stand by Israel come what may. So I was wondering if you could talk to us about that.
Sure. Yeah, I see. My Jewishness as a big part of my social justice work. I like the Jewish value of tikkun olam, which is the repair of the world, which is like a core Jewish value and practice. I see as like deeply informative of my social justice work. Like none of it does not feel in conflict with my Jewish identity. My Jewish identity feels very much like a seamless and enriching part of all the other work that I do. I came to social justice and environmental justice organizing pretty young. I was a young kid who was extremely stressed about the ozone layer when I was maybe 8, because the ozone layer was
really
it was the scary environmental issue of the moment. People were freaking out about it. I was too. Also, incidentally, an amazing example of global cooperation to deal with a global problem that worked. But in any case, I as a teenager, took some time away from school and went to the place in the world I'd always most wanted to go, which was the Amazon rainforest. And it was there that I sort of discovered extractivism. I discovered that the real problems in the Amazon were caused by North American companies. I sort of stumbled on the enormous Chevron Texaco oil spill in the Amazon, learned about Canadian mining companies, and that was really sort of my introduction to, I would say, international solidarity, but also to understanding that the problems we see they're not always what they seem. If you're looking at contamination, deforestation, for example, in the Amazon, the cause turns out to be on Bay Street in Toronto, for example, in many cases. So that was a really great, I feel extremely lucky that I got a very rude awakening to that fact when I was 18, and it has shaped the entire rest of my life. So I think through that perspective, and also through queerness, which has just been such a gift in my life and an invitation to sort of choose your own adventure, that no path is going to be exactly laid out for you, and an introduction to sort of justice and to fighting for rights, for dignity, for difference, that there's no need to assimilate, and in fact, far better not to. And I think through those experiences, it only became natural that in my early 20s, I sort of began to understand that what I had been told about Israel as this sort of safe haven for Jews, and the state that, yes, maybe was created in this kind of messy way, but right now needs to be protected, etc. Like all sort of the basic ideas that I was raised with. It was sort of only natural for me to begin to question them and to see that here is yet another example where this is not as simple as what you've been told, and who is actually being harmed and who is actually being benefiting from the way things currently are. It's not an area where I've done a humongous amount of work, but I certainly here in Toronto and in my work whenever I can try and show up as a Jew in solidarity with Palestinian liberation struggles. Through my work at World Beyond War, have been able to do some fun direct actions around that line as well, and to support however we can. We're constantly amplifying the demand that Canada needs to stop arming Israel. And I can go on, but there's work certainly that we do in that vein, but we always take the lead from Palestinian activists, organizations, and those who are at sort of the front lines of that struggle.
Then I have to ask this follow-up question because Israel has been in the news, intensely, of course. The sort of liberal slash, the sort of like liberal Zionist movement, which has been basically like, the liberal kind of Zionist movement has been protesting against a very strong possibility that legislatively, Israel, at least towards its own Jewish citizens, is going to shift very much to the right and throw, the LGBTQIA plus community under the bus. I say all power to them. I hope that they manage to, topple, Bibi Netanyahu. But when it comes to the very thorny issue of Palestine, do you have any hope that there will be, justice for the Palestinians, that we will see the only game in town, which is the democratic one-state secular solution? Because it's just incredible how still, we have those who are, progressive, socialist, liberal, and everything except Palestine, and still that whole smear campaign of you're an anti-Semite if you criticize Israel, even if you're very careful with the language, even if you're, just legitimately speaking out on Israel's human rights abuses, and not comparing it to the Nazis, but comparing it to settler colonialism of the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and in Australia. But still, it seems as if, despite massive protests and despite the Palestine solidarity movement growing, that it's not advancing justice for Palestine. And I'm just curious, curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, you've brought up a lot of aspects there. I mean, when I speak to, for example, older relatives in my family or other members of the Jewish community, like I do always try to remember that this, and I'm not speaking from the experience of people like living in Palestine or in so-called Israel, but people in the expat community, let's say people in North America, Jews in North America, that this intense attachment to the idea of Israel and like the physical existence of this state is like 100% coming from this deep trauma response. And like I know that very personally, like speaking to my bubby, speaking to like the relatives that I adore in my family who did experience the Holocaust, if not directly by losing their entire extended family or by this, like, and that I think it does not justify the oppression of Palestinians, but I think it informs how we connect and how we relate and like how we understand making inroads in that community or finding ways to build safety in solidarity, in connection with community, redirecting it from sort of like an us versus them or just this huge traumatic fear response into like how do we actually assure safety. So anyways, that's maybe one aspect that was brought up for me by what you said. But in terms of, do I have hope? Yeah, of course I do. But I am very attached to the idea of hope in the way that the incredible abolitionist Mariam Kaba, who's based in the US, frames hope, which is hope as a discipline. I don't see hope as just sort of like this feeling I just want to have,
Oh,
or this sort of like,
interesting.
she really talks about it as a discipline, like as a practice. Other people I've heard frame it as sort of like a muscle that you like work out through exercise and through doing things. So for me, the actual practice of resistance is what gives me hope. I also think we have a tendency to view wins in this very binary way, like either you win or you lose, or there's only one win. And while I think it's very important to have the vision, the larger capital V vision of the future that we want, I think that you have to hold that in your mind so that everything you're working towards is actually moving towards that vision. But that is not the only win. In fact, I think there are often invisible wins that surround us all the time, and it's important to take a moment to see that. Other people might frame this as also a little bit like a harm reduction sort of approach in terms of what are the things that would make a concrete difference to people's life right now? Like every settlement that is stopped, or that would have happened if not for this resistance, that's a win. Every, for example, we're just starting an important campaign right now to try to get Canada to not purchase its first ever armed drones. Every year that purchase is delayed is people not getting killed by armed drones, is, I would say,
Interesting.
somewhat of a win. The big win will be the purchase being canceled. We may or may not achieve that. We're going to work damn hard for it. But every delay, I want to also celebrate as a win, and not just a symbolic win, like something that actually has real impacts on the ground. I think this is a real issue with the way people talk about climate change. People really tend to see it as sort of this all or nothing thing. And so getting to this idea like, well, the planet's already screwed, so who cares? In fact, it's not a light switch.
I'm definitely guilty of that.
But stop it. Like, it's not okay. I mean, you can have your moments of feeling down, but especially as someone who has a platform, we need everyone to understand that you are not facing a world that is either screwed or not. We're facing a world that can be more and more and more and more, or less and less and less screwed. And every chunk will actually make a difference in terms of the survivability of this planet. So I think when people see it, as this like, yes or no, we win or we don't, it makes it really hard to take action versus like, actually, most things in life are not a binary, right? They are a spectrum.
That's fascinating, and well, I'm gonna have to. Well, we're definitely gonna have to have you back on the program to actually dig more into that, because I think a lot of what you said, I think, is actually very. I think it challenges a lot of my my own beliefs and some of my own perceptions. So I find that quite fascinating. But then one quick follow up then was, so it was not difficult for you to come out as a Jewish anti-Zionist when you did say to your community that, sorry, I cannot stand by Israel while Israel does what it's doing to the Palestinians? Or
no, it wasn't. I think in part I'm really lucky to have an extremely loving family that I'm very close to. And I mean, there are some of my close relatives who this is like a huge difference between us. And when the topic comes up, as it does, we have big fights about it. But I also see it as debate is a key element of Jewish culture and Jewish religion. Like the whole point, if you are an extremely religious person and dedicate your life of the story of to the Torah and the study of it, is to debate it with others. So we will have these fierce debates and get upset with each other, and keep loving each other and keep having dinner and stay at the table. And it's okay. And I mean, it can
interesting.
be.
I think we can learn a lot from the extended small family.
And to be honest, like, I think it's a gift of queerness to realize that you're gonna do things that are gonna really upset people, and and that's okay. And you live through it. And you also don't have to completely throw out people who fundamentally disagree with you on something if you can find a way to still sort of be in conversation, to still hold love for each other. I mean, there's exceptions, and of course, everything plays out differently in different contexts. But I also know many people for whom their Jewish community and roots, it was sort of their core community and all the people that they hung out with, and to be sort of renounced for views that you have meant sort of losing all of your people. That is extremely hard. And fortunately for me, I guess that wasn't my situation. I feel like I have lots of different communities, and maybe there were some people who we could not really stay close because of this fundamental difference of politics, but not my core friends and not my family.
Oh, fantastic! Well, I'm very happy for you in that respect, and well, may more take the direction that you take, and again, we can learn a lot from you and your family, and that's a perfect segue to this question, which is, as a queer feminist, a member of two of the most marginalized groups behind Indigenous folk, how do you make the queer and the queer liberationist, the queer and feminist case that both of those movements shouldn't support war, that they should not be supporting any kind of militarism, because so respond to that, and then how do you respond to femonationalists and homonationalists or queer nationalists when they say, hey, Afghanistan, Iran, Russia, Palestine, Hezbollah, these are all misogynists. These are all, misogynist, patriarchal folks. These are all, heteronormative, movements and heteronormative states. Ergo, we should be supporting, NATO, and we should be, supporting sanctions, and we should be supporting, F-35 fighter jets and armed drones because it's going to advance women's liberation and queer liberation in those countries if Canada and its allies have their way with with those nations. How do you respond to those to those in your community who do support who do support militarism, the femonationalism, the homo/queer nationalists?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of queers out there. There's a lot of feminists. Like, I would never presume to represent all of them or to like have common cause with all of them. Like, there's a lot of people. I think that like a lot of us really early in our political connection have this usually a sad moment where we realize like, oh man, this other person is X like me, but turns out I can't really trust them, or turns out they're also kind of an asshole, or turns out they have these like fundamentally different politics. Like, I do think queers on average are more likely to be sort of sensitive to injustice, to harm done to others. I've no real proof of this, but my guess is that anyone who has experienced being targeted because of who they are, hopefully has a little bit more understanding of how that applies to others. But I mean, many people are not, or many people are. I mean, there's every type of feminist that exists out there, just like there's every type of person that exists out there. So I don't know. For me, it doesn't really feel like a conflict. What feels challenging, though, is, of course, is to deal with, for example, a prime minister like the Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, who speaks very well and can speak a very lefty language and can talk in this way where he is a feminist champion, or he is a so forth and so forth. And it's frankly makes our work, I would say, much harder in some ways than a politician who just is more right wing and speaks that way, or who just more blatantly will say, oh, we need to bomb the bad guys or whatever. With Trudeau speaking in this way as though he's part of this sort of feminist global movement, you have to first do the work of sort of explaining why what he's doing is not feminist, or if it is, it's not a feminism we stand behind because it's still dropping bombs on people. It's still harming women, children, men, everyone. It's still not actually about a gender-based liberation or so many things. I mean, it's the same
Yeah.
thing in terms of his climate change policy, and he speaks as though he's a climate champion at the same time as he's building pipelines. Like you have, but it's harder to convince people that he is not taking positive steps towards climate justice because he speaks the language in speeches of there is no bigger crisis facing humans than climate change, and we are responsible for making the change. Like he speaks in that way that first you have to kind of to teach people about what he's really doing and why what he's saying is less important than his actions. So I think that's where it like comes up.
But that said, have you been having also a difficult time in trying to explain to people what I often say, which is that you can't be an environmentalist, let alone eco-socialist, and support any kind of militarism because the military is the biggest climate offender on the planet, and those wars, which are not about feminism or not about queer liberation, and they're not even about addressing whatever grievances that may exist in whatever targeted country, but militarism, imperialism is all about the extraction of whatever fossil fuels or whatever. So it's only empowering those very sinister movements, and those who engage in pink washing or the or I don't know what the feminist equivalent of that of that term is. So have you been having any difficulties in trying to not just convince your those within the communities, but even those within the climate communities that guys, warfare is not the way to solve the climate crisis. Actually, it's the complete opposite, and and so forth.
My issue is less that people can be convinced and more that people are just not thinking about militarism at all. I think this is maybe different in other countries, but in Canada, it's just not even on people's radar. When I do speak with folks in climate movement organizing around the role of the Canadian military, as you were saying, in emissions, but also the ways that so much of the devastating extraction of materials, of like whether it's uranium or metals or rare earth elements, is actually going to the building of war machines, or for even the role domestically that the Canadian military plays in continuing colonization, in suppressing Indigenous resistance, in surveillance. They get it. They just hadn't really thought of it before. And frankly, their hands are very full that it sort of feels like another huge thing to take on. So my experience has been that climate movements in Canada are very sort of open to partnering and interested, but are already sort of frantically doing a lot. And militarism in general in Canada is very rarely discussed. I feel like where we are with this issue right now is where the understanding of Canadian mining was about 10 years ago. People, when you sort of about Canada as being the global leader in mining internationally, people were shocked. They hadn't heard of that. They were very surprised. And I feel like in the past 10 years of doing that work, I've seen a huge shift where now people do understand that that's a humongous issue and they want to see it changed. I feel like we're in terms of Canadian militarism, we're about 10 years ago in terms of people not yet understanding that, yes, we have a global military superpower to our south. And of course, the US is everything is much larger than ours, but that Canadian militarism is a huge issue, both in Canada and globally, and that we can't ignore it anymore. I think we're certainly working very, very hard to get this on people's radar and to take action around it. And I think that is happening more and more, but I think in a few more years, we'll see a humongous change in terms of public consciousness in Canada around it.
Well, one can only hope, but then this leads to one can only hope. I mean, I still take issue though, because I've heard a version of that. Hey, the Canadians that are involved in abolitionists, the Canadians that are involved in racial, social justice matters, they have, that's already so time consuming that they just don't have the headspace to be speaking out against, Canadian imperialism. But I find that strange because, America, because like the American left knows how to chew gum and walk at the same time. Like, yes, people are very stressed out about not having single payer healthcare and not having, meaningful, affordable college and stuff like that. But at the same time, I just find it strange how in the U.S., people there can speak out on, on anti-imperialism, whereas in Canada, I mean, but that said, Canada is very great. The Canadian left, I find, is very good at speaking out against the plight of Indigenous people. But then how can they not be speaking out against Canadian imperialism when the Canadian military and the Canadian Secret Services, that is like the police and settler colonialism and white supremacy on steroids. Mm-hmm. But that's just my beef with some of the with some of the Canadian comrades we have who make that excuse. So I'm curious, your response to your response to that.
Yeah, I think movements sort of come up and down in waves, and I think this is true in the States too. Actually, this is just not a moment where the anti-war movement or movements are having incredible prominence. Like, this is a moment where other movements are far more powerful and growing, and I think this does move in waves. I'm not saying waves as like this external natural thing we have no control over, but yeah. I that is the pattern of movements. And so I think other than in places where a capital W war is happening on the ground right now, other than in those places, I think globally lefty movements there's just less of a focus on war and militarism right now and more of a focus on other issues. But of course, everywhere there are people also speaking out about this. I don't think it's that movements in Canada are not capable of working on multiple issues, and I think they are. But I think that there is this element of sort of comparing to the States and not seeing Canada's military harm because of being sort of overshadowed by like the overwhelming militarism of the US. I think there's an element of that. And we're obviously trying to shift that and help people see like, well, let's look at Canadian militarism. It doesn't look exactly like it does in the States, but it's super harmful. And yeah.
But that being said, I will say the following: America, though, is still terrible when it comes to address the American left is still terrible when it comes to addressing the plight of their Indigenous people. So, so it's interesting comparing and contrasting, but hopefully, with enough mobilization and enough, dedicated people within those movements, that they, that it can advance to where it's not just a passing, subject, but it's, number one on the, issues that folks are addressing when organizing a protest and education session and so forth. But that's a perfect segue actually to this question, which is how do you overcome, the toxic debate that happens frequently on the left, which is the identity politics versus the class struggle debate? Where do you stand, and how would you explain to someone that, this is how you chew gum and walk at the same time, or this is how we shoot, all the evils with one AR-15. Sorry to use war as an analogy for that, but curious your response on that, though.
Yeah, I don't get drawn into those debates very often somehow. I find that usually those debates come up because people are trying to, I guess, recruit you to a particular organization or a particular thing. So they want there to be sort of a real focus on socialism is the answer, or this is the harm, and we're only focusing on that thing. And I think that there just is space for people to focus on various things. I think it's really great for some people to really become experts in class struggle and to look at everything through a lens of capitalism, look at everything through a lens of like worker class exploitation. Like, I think that's an amazing expertise to have. And I guess I just don't think it has to conflict with other people focusing on another angle. And yeah. I mean, obviously I hope that, I really love an approach that I think it was I'm just going to double check the name. I think it was Bernice Reagan Johnson. Yes, it was, who was a very incredible singer, social activist, who I think was one of the founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the U.S. and one of the freedom singers, and she was part of Sweet Honey and the Rock, like these incredible musical pieces that are like, I feel like the backbone of the civil rights movement, etc. Anyway, she gave a speech once where she talked about the difference between home organizing spaces and coalitional spaces. And I think about it a lot. Like you can have, everyone's, I think, needs a space where your views are very, very closely shared, where you can really kind of go back and forth and hone what you're thinking, and possibly groups who are in the same identity as you in some way. So I think she talked about it in terms of like, yes, it's important as a Black person to have other Black people who share similar politics, who you can like be in really close community with and feel safe and feel heard and all those things. But coalitional spaces are also important, and you cannot expect the same type of cohesion and sort of instant getting each other. And in fact, if you have that in a coalitional space, it's not a coalition, like you're just your own people. So to also have these organizing spaces where you can find common cause, where there's still reason to work together, but where there are clashes, where you don't totally agree, and that's okay, and to embrace that and to movement build around that. So I guess I seek out, and I think World Beyond War in general really tries to bring people together under common cause and not stress that we have all the same politics on everything. Of course, there are lines. Of course, people cannot be racist to each other, cannot harm each other. Like, of course, there has to be
or sexist,
enough together to work together. But to feel discomfort is good. If you're trying to work in coalition, if you're trying to work with other people, like you're gonna feel uncomfortable sometimes, and to try to work through it. And I may have not 100% used the same words that Bernice Johnson Reagan used in that excellent speech of hers, but I think back on the core ideas of it a lot. And I notice in my own organizing, like, okay, where am I feeling, oh yeah, you get me totally, and where am I feeling like, ooh, this is a stretch, and to make sure I have the balance of both sort of in my organizing.
Interesting. And then how do you explain to people that they should not support NATO or the pivot to or the pivot to Asia, which is going to see NATO nations go to war with China? I'm curious, how do you explain to people why they shouldn't support either of those policies, especially with the ongoing NATO-Russia-Ukraine war and the efforts to provoke, the West supporting, reactionary movements in China, from Hong Kong capitalist separatists to Uyghur extremists and Taiwan independence, which, if you dig more deep into it, they would actually like to overthrow the entire Chinese system. So how have you been trying to explain to people that that we should not be escalating a Cold War or a hot war with with China and Russia, and that détente, dialogue, peace, and diplomacy, that should be our only way forward when it comes to when it comes to Canadian-Chinese relations, Canadian-Russian relations, and so forth.
Yeah, I mean that's a lot. I think that, the short answer is it obviously depends who I'm talking to. I think that in terms of how do we sort of convince people of things, or how do we bring people around to seeing something in a different way, I think that a lot of people sort of have just a basic lack of understanding of NATO's history, or what it was ostensibly created, and sort of what it's been involved in since. My experience on the left in Canada is that people in general are deeply distrustful of NATO, like understand that any sort of super military power is probably not to be trusted. They may not sort of know everything that NATO's been involved in, but my experience of the left in general is sort of distrustful about it, but maybe doesn't have a lot of understanding, maybe doesn't realize how much NATO is sort of structured to get the country members to buy their interoperable weapons, which is basically always US company weapons. So how much of the funding through NATO is really being channeled into, for example, Lockheed Martin. Like, I think that can be a real moment of awakening for a lot of people. I think that in Canada, there's a lot of understanding that, for example, that the US is creating a lot of its so-called threats through its own military actions. Like, I think there's a lot of understanding, broadly speaking, in mainstream media, even in Canada, that a lot of the US's so-called enemies are enemies of the US because they have been on the bad end of a bomb or a drone attack or so forth. So I think that it's not actually that hard to get people to understand that NATO, in fact, is not a defensive alliance, that it has been undermining global peace and human security. It's been exacerbating conflict and continues to do that in various ways. I don't think that people necessarily, however, are ready to sort of campaign for Canada to leave NATO. It's very hard to imagine a foreign policy for Canada that isn't 100% dictated by the United States, but a lot of people want that. And so I think part of our job as anti-war movements is to help people imagine other alternatives, and to see clearly what is happening, and to recognize that, yeah, of course, there are many alternatives to NATO, but also to our understanding of militarism. People see sort of peace as this very difficult thing versus understanding that, in fact, war is the difficult thing. Peace is much more likely to happen naturally. What doesn't happen naturally is war. War happens because the billions of dollars invested in creating it. And this is maybe I'm answering maybe a bigger question than you asked, but I think helping people see alternative visions is what I get really excited about in my job. But I mean, right now is a very tough time to be, as you've alluded to be critical of NATO, to be critical of anything.
Yes, I had to leave. I had to leave my dinner early because my mother was denouncing, Marine Le Pen, who's not exactly 100% behind Stand with Ukraine, and stuff like that. When I was listening to just some of her kind of like pro-NATO arguments, in my head I was thinking, oh, rolling my eyes. We have our work cut out for us in overcoming the propaganda that people are subjected to. But but I sometimes wonder, all of those people who are so pro-war, who say that, like, we must confront China, that we must confront Russia, that we must bomb to smithereens such and such a country, all because our professional liar politicians and media are saying that we need to go to war with such and such a country. But do you think that the anti-war movement would grow overnight if the powers to be just introduced a draft conscription again, and then all those people who claim that they're all for war overnight would be like, oh, no, I'm not for me getting my neck in the line. So I'm curious to respond to that, because I remember talking with your colleague Greta and like saying, hey, since we live in such a war society, why don't people practice what they preach? Why don't we support reintroducing the draft? And then all of a sudden you would see people in the streets protesting an end to such and such a war. I'm curious your response on that.
Yeah, I think the right and sort of the military-industrial complex is very good at drumming up fear and using fear as a way to justify, I mean, literally any military budget, any expense on weapons, and playing up the human impulse to want to protect yourself and to want to protect your community. And I think they're very good at that. And I don't think people in Canada, for example, want Trudeau to keep sending weapons to Ukraine because they like war or they want war. No doubt some people want war, and it's disproportionately the people who have real decision-making stake in what's happening. But the average person who supports sending weapons to Ukraine definitely does not do so because they support war. They're doing so, I think, from a place of a feeling of solidarity with Ukrainians, and also from a place of fear, like a what if Russia invades us kind of thing. So I think that we have to be able to speak with those people in a way that understands that they're scared and doesn't dismiss them as ridiculous, because that doesn't get us anywhere, to treat the majority of people like they're ridiculous or like they don't know what they're talking about. I just don't think that's constructive. I think there were a few parts of your
but you don't think if we that, so say Canada, Australia,
right,
all those scale countries were to reintroduce like a conscription, do you think that would help the anti-war movement if if conscription was introduced, and then all of a sudden all those people who would go rah rah rah, NATO's a force for good in the world, Team Canada, F yeah, would then all of a sudden go like, oh no, I'm gonna I want to see an end to the war now. Yeah, curious response.
No, I think you're right that would be extremely unpopular. But also at this point, if there was a feeling that Canadian troops en masse were being sent to Ukraine, that would also be deeply unpopular, I think, right now. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that is a difference right now. There's really a framing of like, well, Ukraine is asking us to send them weapons and we're sending them weapons. You know what I mean? And there is this sort of maintaining of distance in a way that I think would be different if there was this feeling of like Canadian troops being sent over. But yes, a draft would be wildly unpopular and would never be implemented right now because it would be political suicide. Like, yeah. And there, of course, is something to that, like where people can talk about war in the abstract and they're not really internalizing people being killed.
Not ready to practice what they preach, but I think that's why. I mean, yeah, I think that's probably why I get very frustrated with with pro-NATO folks and the xenophobic crowd, and it's like, okay, if you guys want to really see war so badly, and then this is why I sometimes do praise the universe. Introduce a introduce a draft. That would then flood all of the peace organizations and people who don't want to go to war. Because I mean, yeah, it's not nice that that people only seem to want to join a war, that people only seem to support a war if they're if they're not the ones that that suffer anything from it. But at the same time, I think that's why I sometimes don't lionize the anti-war movement of Vietnam anymore, because I think Nixon realized that there were some people who it's not that they were against the war, they just did not like America losing the war, hence why he could talk about that there is a silent majority that actually does want us to win this war in in Vietnam. And yeah, curious your response to that.
Well, what I was thinking about actually was that what you're bringing up, I think, is a really good reminder for me. For example, this campaign that we're just launching now around getting Canada to cancel its planned purchase of armed drones, that maybe where we do need to put a lot of focus is on helping people be reconnected to, like, these drones. Their purpose is to drop bombs on people, like on humans, to kill people, and that's what they are about. And who are the people that Canada thinks these drones should be bombing? Like, what is the even correct way that these hypothetically could be used? I don't think there is one. And perhaps a failing of our movement work and probably most movement works is that we can get so caught up in making such a strong intellectual case for why what we're campaigning for is right, or is morally just, or is whatever, and forgetting to reconnect with the same thing you're bringing up with the idea of a draft, like with people's own humanity. And I think, for example, we're just launching a website now, noarmeddrones.ca. We just, like, this week are launching it as a sort of new campaign. And you are prompting me to realize that I think we need more there that's about this is the real experience on the ground level of these drone attacks. This is why we're opposing this, for all the intellectual reasons about why Canada doesn't need that, but also because their sole purpose is to drop bombs on people when they are carrying these missiles. There are other ostensible purposes for these drones. They're also intended for surveillance of Canadian protests. There's many other reasons the Canadian military is getting them that are very creepy and not okay either. But to remind people that armed drones are used to kill people, and to remind people why that's horrifying, and to bring to the forefront the experiences of people who have survived them or people whose family members have not survived them. So that's going to be my homework after this, is to
actually
that.
I have to ask, how's one of the board members of World Beyond War from Ukraine, who shares my name, Youri. Do you have any news on how he's doing, and the impacts of the unfortunate ongoing special military operation between the war between Russia and Ukraine, how he's doing and so forth?
Yeah, he personally is doing okay. We just spoke recently at the last board call last week. He is extremely busy. Perhaps keeping very busy and organizing around this is helpful for probably himself, like emotionally as well. But yeah, his work is incredibly important, and I think that people really look to him. I mean, obviously we do within our own organization as one of our board members who lives in Kyiv, but I think outside of our organization as well, people really look to him as a voice speaking something other than keep sending weapons, keep putting our troops on the front line, like a different way that peace can happen. And he, I think, really calls it as it is. He also, can you hear me?
Yeah. Go on.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think he calls it like it is. He's not going to shy away from condemning the violence of the Russian invasion, but he also doesn't think that receiving billions more weapons from North America is the answer or is going to save anyone's life. So I think he plays an incredibly important role right now, globally, in countering a lot of the messaging that we're all inundated with all day, every day. But yeah, we also feel really lucky to be able to work very closely with him.
That's a perfect segue to my second to last question. My second to last question is, as you know, I moderated and helped organize a debate between World Beyond War's David Swanson and Arnold August, who's one of the finest, Cuban experts and Cuba Solidarity figures and Canada Files, contributor. Both of these, brilliant anti-imperialists. And of course, the debate was on if wars are ever justifiable. And I know you're anti-war, but surely don't you think that, that wars, sometimes are justifiable if it's a country that's fighting an imperialist aggressor or resisting settler colonialism, like Syria resisting, the Western Gulf, Turkish, Israeli-backed Wahhabi death squads, or settler colonialism, indigenous people resisting, that invader, that's kind of an invasion of multiple white supremacist invaders, and yeah, I'm curious your response on that, and if the answer is still no, then please do make your case.
Yeah, I mean, David's an excellent debater, and I think that's probably more his style than mine. As you know, World Beyond War really believes in nonviolent resistance to militarism. And in fact, we're hosting our global conference just after International Peace Day starting on September 22nd. And the theme this year is nonviolent resistance to militarism. But we mean that literally. Like, we mean people who are blocking incoming invasions with their bodies, or, for example, in Ukraine, as many people did, by changing around the overpass signs, by blocking highways, by really blocking militarism, whether that is sort of foreign invasion type of war, or whether that is, for example, colonial militarized violence, but not just people protesting outside of weapons factories. Like, we're talking about people actually doing nonviolent resistance to militarism. And the reason we're focusing on that for our conference is we feel like there are many, many examples of this that people never, ever see. So we think there are many different options. I personally am not interested in sort of like World Beyond War stances. What we support and work on being in solidarity with is nonviolent struggle. I'm not personally interested in condemning, I don't know, whatever tactics an oppressed group is doing. Like, that's not my role. It's not interesting to me. What we're interested in opposing is the military-industrial complex, the war machine. What are the real military powers? I'm just frankly not spending my time criticizing what people who are backed into a corner are doing. I'm much more interested in helping to build alternatives to using weapons, helping to train people in nonviolent resistance, in noncompliance, and in various different, very cool ways that people all throughout history have resisted militarism and violence, and in really taking on the big enemies here, right? Like, really taking on the military-industrial complex. That's what I'm focused on. But
no problem.
Got a different answer from David, and that's fine.
No, that's a great response. But and if on the thorny subject of Ukraine, if you could have been an advisor to the Russian government and say to them, hey, listen, I understand that you have legitimate concerns about NATO, and I understand your concerns about the persecuted Eastern Ukrainians of a Russian background, but your special military operation is only going to further inflame Russophobia and further advance the neo-Banderite and NATO movement you claim you want to eradicate. So I'm curious, if you could have talked to if you could have talked to the Russian government or even some of the Russian people, as Dmitry, Laskaris, Rick Sterling, both who've been on the program. It seemed as if a lot of the Russian voices they met were all, we don't want to have this war, but we felt that there was no other option but to finally respond to NATO expansion and the aggressiveness of the ultra nationalist, the Western-backed Ukraine. I'm curious, your response on that.
I mean, this is probably annoying, but I don't think I really have one. I feel, as many people do, that Russia was provoked in many ways, but had many, many other options besides launching a military invasion of Ukraine. Like, I think that's obvious. So if I guess was in a position of advising, I think I would say that there are many, many better options for what Russia could do.
Such as?
I mean, they could have. I mean, Dave Swanson has actually an excellent piece on the World Beyond War website called "Dear Russia Had No Choice, Friends," that lists out like a whole list of 100 choices. I don't have those off the top of my head, but okay. I think that they're, for example, were already evacuating people from Eastern Ukraine who were feeling threatened by the Ukrainian government. They could continue doing that. My understanding is that they offered those evacuees almost no support once they actually did come to Russia. That's something they certainly could have done more. They could have done any number of things within the UN sphere, within the ICC, asking them to investigate the crimes in Donbass or join the International Criminal Court, for instance. Like, there's many sort of very flawed but still useful international diplomatic tools that can be used before invading another country. There are, I confess that my area of expertise is not in knowing what Russia is currently getting out of this conflict. So it's hard for me to advise why they should have done something different, because it's hard for me to see what they can possibly be getting out of this right now. So it seems like whatever their goals were there was probably a better way of doing it, because the loss of life for Russian soldiers has been tremendous and devastating. The huge financial cost of this war has been devastating to Russia. Like, it's hard to imagine that this was the best option for whatever they wanted to achieve personally. But this is not my area of expertise at all. My area of expertise and work right now is about shifting, I mean, frankly, what Canada is doing, and to hopefully move Canada away from a place of exacerbating this conflict and fanning the flames of war and towards a place of supporting a diplomatic solution. Apparently, Canada's famous for peacekeeping. This would be a great time to showcase that skill set if we do have it. That's where my focus has been. Plus, I think my focus is, in general, as World Beyond War, is always about supporting the global peace movement, global anti-war movement, skilling up, helping people, take more and more powerful action. And I will say, part of our conference in September will include a training on unarmed civilian resistance and sort of concretely understanding what are things that people can do globally in these very scary situations. So that's sort of my pitch as well, for people to come out to the conference in September for a deeper understanding of this.
Alrighty, well, and I'll also just say, I'll also just say the following. Even though I also understand completely why Russia felt that they had to do, what they do, I still think that it's unfortunate that they felt that this was the only option, because it has only further inflamed pro-NATO views across Europe. It has only further inflamed, the very things that Russia claims they want to eradicate, which is, the Banderite movement, and the pro-NATO movement that's in Ukraine, and just like with the Palestinians, or just like with the with the movement to have a reunified Ireland. Although I completely understand why the Palestinians and why the IRA felt that they had to resort to terrorism, and of course we can say that yes, you have all the right to resist an occupier, but it's just that when the when the Palestinians do target a cafe, when the IRA does blow up, when the IRA does blow up a pub, that only further inflames, the state to be much more repressive, and then those innocent lives that get lost, their only response is, okay, we have to, be even much more tough on the Palestinian resistance or Irish republicanism, or when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, have to be more tough on Russia. So, curious your response on that.
Yeah, I mean, we often cite the pretty well-known research of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, who did that really enormous study where they demonstrated statistically that I think it was from 1900 to 2006, nonviolent resistance was twice as successful as armed resistance, and resulted in more stable democracies that didn't just revert back to violence. And so did try to sort of empirically make this case that nonviolence actually works better than war more of the time, regardless of what you think is the morally superior way to resist, what is just actually more successful. So, I mean, that's a study that we have looked at quite a bit, and that we find helpful, and I think speaks to sort of some of the examples that you're saying.
Well, here's hoping that World Beyond War, and and those voices can shift us to a more peaceful world, and having non-violent ways to end differences, differences and so forth. And actually, before I get to this question there, Rachel, is there any events that World Beyond War is organizing that you would like people to check out?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big one is certainly No War 2023, hashtag No War 2023. That's our global conference that's coming up September 22nd to 24th. As I mentioned, the theme is nonviolent resistance to militarism, and I'm really excited about this conference. I really think that the firsthand stories people are going to be hearing about nonviolent resistance to invasions, to occupations, to military violence are going to be stories people haven't heard before. And we do get asked a lot, like, okay, well, you say you're against war, but what's the alternative? This is going to be sort of a deep dive into what those alternatives can look like, and not just sort of in a hypothetical way or in a very peaceful moment, but like in the actual moments where violence is underway. So I'm really excited about that. And it is a global conference that's open to everyone. We've just opened up registration for it. So worldbeyondwar.org/nowar2023.
All righty. Now, we end the program with the questionnaire that was done by Marcel Proust, and later the French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, and then later my hero, the late, great James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. So, Rachel, it's your turn to do this before I let you enjoy the rest of your afternoon and day. Rachel, what is your favorite word?
My favorite word? Maybe serendipity.
Serendipity. Oh, that is a nice word. What is your least favorite word?
Moist.
Moist. Okay. What turns you on creatively, emotionally, and psychologically?
I think that when people combine different spheres that don't normally meet, so when people can use like music or language in connection with something that's usually super like dry or practical, or when people just sort of mishmash disciplines in really weird ways, love that.
Well, interesting. And then what turns you off then?
I guess the opposite, honestly, when people are super rigid and dogmatic, are very much in one silo. I didn't last long in academia, and I think maybe this is why. Yeah, that's a challenge for me.
Okay, interesting. And what sound or noise? Yeah, what sound or noise do you love?
What?
What sound or noise do you love?
It's kind of a boring answer, but just water. If I can be near water, I'm very happy.
No problem. Many people on this program have expressed their love of the sound of oceans and stuff like that. then what sound or noise do you dislike then?
So I have 2 young children, and the particular really high-pitched screeching, it's my weakness. I cannot deal with it.
Then what's your favorite curse word?
And
it can be and it can be in Hebrew or Yiddish, and you are from Canada. If there's a favorite, French Quebec curse word, feel free to share.
That's a good question. I do like fuck. I think it's a great contribution from the English language. I think it's extremely versatile. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually my favorite word. My own favorite curse. Then what profession would you love to do if you weren't doing the brilliant anti-imperialist peace organizing and all the social justice warrior stuff that you do? So if you weren't doing that, what profession would you love to do?
Oh, I would be a potter, and I would also cook for huge groups of people. These are both things that I do a little bit, but with a lot more time, I would do them much, much more.
And what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Most professions. I'm very picky. I would not want to, honestly, any profession where I have to wear a fancy suit and go to a tall office tower every day, like, it's not the job for me. And I certainly would not want to be an elected official of any government.
And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear? What would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates? And even if you're an atheist or an agnostic, please feel free to please don't be shy. Answer the question.
I think just like welcome. Here's some ice cream. I I will say there's an incredible TikTok creator who, if you haven't encountered yet, you should encounter. And her entire shtick is that she is the receptionist at heaven. And it is the most creative, heartwarming, and funniest bit of like media that I have encountered in ages. And it's just this person's TikTok account of her as the receptionist at heaven. You should check it out. She's amazing.
Yeah, definitely will. Oh my gosh, I wish I could continue to talk to you for more hours and do the kind of like Youri Rogan experience, but I'm gonna have to let you go. So we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Rachel Small, who leads World Beyond War's Canada chapter. Again, she's a peace campaigner and anti-mining justice activist, anti-war, anti-imperialist peace activist, as well as a solidarity activist to Canada's Indigenous people. Rachel, thank you so much for coming on the program. I hope that this will be the first of many. I also have to, I already did thank you, but I also can't thank you enough when, wanted to organize something about Syria. You were, you were vital in, in helping, helping organize that. Please continue to do the great work you do. And I know that it is Pride Month, so, have the, there and my, all the different flags. So and may we also live to see the day where heteronormativity is completely vanquished along with sexism and all the other evils, and keep doing the great work you do.
Thanks. Happy Pride to you too. Take care, Youri.